In various talks and homilies now, I have reiterated my belief that the greatest threat to the growth of Catholicism in this country is not atheism or agnosticism, but indifferentism. Christ himself had strong words for those who are tainted by indifference. He described it as being lukewarm. Neither hot nor cold, neither for God or against God, just detached, apathetic, and aloof. But detached, apathetic, and aloof to the most consequential issue of all, one's eternal salvation. Now, indifference is not only a poison that inspirits our society, it can also be a virus that infects the church and those within the church. In the spiritual life, we call it acedia, when for whatever reason we experience a desire to flee from the spiritual. We all have that sort of experience sometimes, like, I can't really be bothered to go to Mass, or I'm not really interested in praying, or I'm not really interested in studying the teachings of the church, or I'm really going to do everything I can to avoid going to confession. I'll make up any sort of excuse possible. All this makes that indifference palpable, and instead we take comfort in worldly things and worldly ideas. Now we see how this spirit of indifference is made manifest also when we hear people wanting to change or reduce or diminish the eternal truth of Christ's teachings, or when people say, let's try and dismiss the challenge of the gospel. And often that's driven by this false assumption that for the church to survive in the 21st century, she should just parrot the same innocuous platitudes that we hear parroted by pop culture. In other words, the church should just follow the status quo. But that kind of thinking will never produce saints. Saints whose very lives can point confused souls in this world to heaven. Instead, that kind of thinking will only inculcate that apathy, inoculate against spiritual fervor, and engender a wishy-washiness in the church that attracts no one. And so the churches will surely but gradually empty even further. Today's readings, however, speak to us of the antidote to spiritual indifference and catechetical wishy-washiness. And I think we can summarize that antidote in one word: zeal. Zeal. What is zeal? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas puts it like this. He said that zeal arises from the intensity of love. Zeal arises from the intensity of love. In other words, zeal is an effect of love. The more in love you are, the more you are prepared to withstand, overcome any opposition or resistance that is put in your way. Zeal burns through obstacles, dismantles lies, and challenges indifference. And no more important is that gift than in the life of faith. And yet how seldom do we hear talk in our church today of a zeal for souls? Where do we see that? Where do we see the effect of that love, an intense love for God, manifest in the way that we as a church withstand opposition, oppression, and any form of resistance to the proclamation of the faith? Our Lord said that he came to bring fire to the earth, because as St. Pope John Paul II said, a fire can only be lit by something that is itself on fire. If you have the flame of faith lit in your heart, then we should literally burn with desire to bring other souls to heaven, to light the flame of faith alive in their hearts, no matter what the price or personal cost. And indeed, that's a grand and tall ask. That's the challenge. But as Christ makes clear on the cross, Love doesn't count the cost. Of course, our love for Christ and the zeal that we must have can carry great personal worldly cost, a worldly cost. And today's first reading makes that point clear. The prophet Jeremiah was thrown into a well because the king's leading men found his words disheartening. In other words, they resented being reminded of God's voice, of God's truth, the challenge of God's message. A voice that Jeremiah refused to compromise on or water down or just turn into wishy-washy nothingness. And I guess being thrown into a well then is a bit like being thrown into prison. Last week I came across an article about Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, who was a Hungarian prelate. He stood as a zealous defender of the Catholic faith in his country at great personal cost. When the communists took over in the 1950s, they immediately tried to secularize over 4,000 Catholic schools. The zeal of Cardinal Mindszenty led him to drive to every single village and announce to the people there very, very publicly to not be fooled by the false promises of the communist regime, and to never give up their schools, no matter what the cost, and to never hand over their land, and not to be indifferent to what was taking place before them. And nothing would get in that cardinal's way. He was totally unafraid to stand in front of guns, in front of tanks, to preach the truth at the risk of his own peril. All for the love of God. Completely unafraid to speak up and expose the ideological lies that are there embedded within the rhetoric of communism. And as such, the government labelled him the centre of counter-revolutionary forces in Hungary. He, the one man, by virtue of his zeal, is labelled the centre of a revolutionary force. And so, like the prophet Jeremiah, he was imprisoned. One of only, I think, 6 cardinals who have been put in prison, including Cardinal Pell, and 5 of them are on their way to canonization. He was tortured daily for his determination, but he did not waver once, for his zeal and his determination were born of a love of God that was unflappable. Now, what struck me most about this story was the words of Pope Pius XII, who, after hearing of the false imprisonment of Cardinal Mindszenty, addresses the crowd in St. Peter's Square in Rome. And the words that he spoke were words of zeal. They are a masterful description of the nature, role, and purpose of the Catholic Church. This is what he said, addressing the crowd. So just imagine the crowd in St. Peter's Square hearing these words. He says, "Do you want a church that remains silent when she should speak, that diminishes the law of God where she is called to proclaim it loudly, wanting to accommodate itself to the will of man? Do you want a church that departs from the unshakable foundations upon which Christ founded her, taking the easy way of adapting herself to the popular opinions of the day? A church that is just prey to current trends. A church that does not condemn the suppression of conscience and does not stand up for the liberty of the people. Beloved sons and daughters, spiritual heirs of numberless confessors and martyrs, is that the church you venerate and love? Would you recognize in such a church the features of your mother? Would you be able to imagine a successor of St. Peter submitting to such demands?" Masterful rhetoric. And how does the crowd react? How does the church react? with a single word that was said by those who were present to have been proclaimed like thunder. The crowd simply cried, "No! No!" Now that's leadership. These are the words we need to hear in Australia today, because they're words of vision, not words of compromise. And so you can see how zeal is itself infectious. From the zeal of Cardinal Mindszenty, it passes zeal, infects zeal into the heart of the Holy Father. And the zeal of the Holy Father's words spreads to the people, and they rediscover the true nature of Catholicism. So you and I must pray for that holy zeal. Zeal is not arrogance. Zeal is not hubris. Zeal is not condemnation. Zeal is an effect of love. And if you and I have zeal, then we will never give up on the journey to heaven, no matter what the price or personal cost. We will never allow anything to get in our way in the path to true love. But in the words of St. Bonaventure, the day you and I no longer burn with love, many others, the others out there, will die of the cold. Perhaps more than ever, we too need to join our voices to the voice of that crowd in St. Peter's Square, in response to the zealous words of that good Pope, in defense of that saintly and zealous cardinal, to say no to the coldness of indifference, to say no to the cowardice of compromise, to say no to the bureaucratization or liberalization of the Catholic faith, and say yes instead to the fire of divine love and the zeal for souls.